Professor Alice Roberts has been using archaeological human remains for years to help us understand how our predecessors lived.
Her new book shares tales of medieval brutality, disease and injury, and it gives us an insight into the experience of human suffering in the past. She joins us now. Morning.
Good morning.
Great to have you here. I mean, brutality really is the word, isn't it? Some of the stuff is gruesome that you've been finding out about.
It really is. I mean, the book's called Crypt, and the subtitle...
There's a clue there.
The subtitle is Life, Death and Disease in the Middle Ages, and it is mostly death and disease. And I think that you can read those stories and find some comfort in them, in that we're not in the Middle Ages anymore. Because, I mean, the diseases that racked Britain and racked Europe were just horrendous. I mean, the Black Death in the 14th century carried off between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. I mean, it's mortality that you can't even begin to think about. If you imagine half of your friends and family dying, and that's what people were facing. And I'm also talking about leprosy and syphilis, but also violence as well, outbreaks of violence. It starts with the horrendous St Brice's Day massacre in the 11th century. There's an awful outbreak of kind of ethnically motivated violence against Vikings.
What are the stories that stick in your mind? You do all the research, you go to the history books, you're doing all this archaeology. What are the... Give me one story that really has stayed with you since committing it to paper.
It's really interesting because in my work, I'm always looking for the bigger picture. So I'm looking for kind of evidence of what's going on a population level. So, for instance, looking at where the Black Death originates and how it spreads across Europe, and the fact that the Black Death actually is a resurgence of a disease that's been with us since at least the Neolithic. It's not a new thing. So there's that bigger picture stuff, but the things that really stick with me are the individuals. Yeah. So there's this one individual from Winchester in the book who's a young man, he's in his 20s. So you have his skeleton, I can look at his skeleton. We can see that he's got some changes in his bones, which are maybe suggestive that he had an infection. But now we've got this incredible extra way of diagnosing ancient diseases. I mean, I would just look at the surface of the bones, maybe do some x-rays, but my geneticist friends can now go in and basically use the same techniques that we used during COVID, to test for COVID, on ancient remains. And this young man had leprosy. So we know that he was suffering from leprosy. But in his grave as well is really unusual because he's got objects with him in the grave, which is, at this time in the Middle Ages, most people are buried without objects. So the bodies were put in the ground completely naked, maybe wrapped in a shroud, but there's no other objects with them. But he's got something, he's got a scallop shell, and the scallop shell has got 2 holes in it. So it's been attached to something, and we're pretty sure it was attached to a pilgrim bag. So he probably went to Santiago de Compostela.
I was going to say, I did that walk once.
Did you?
Yeah, and you see those scallops all along the route, don't you? That people have found them and left them, and then somebody else picks them up, and that's happened for hundreds of years.
It's a symbol of St James, and the fact that it's pierced, it's probably attached to a scrip, a pilgrim's bag, that's accompanied him into the grave. Wow. So those things where you're suddenly seeing somebody very close up, and it's an opportunity to see ordinary people as well, because, of course, the history books, going back that far, we're mostly just learning about the elite, the wealthy elite. We're not really learning about ordinary people. And I like that about archaeology, that we see everybody.
Because it's one thing, you know, talking about Viking massacre, it's one thing to work on stories that have been passed down through generations. But this is the physical evidence that you can't argue with, can you?
Yeah, and the massacre is particularly interesting because it's quite unusual to have an archaeological site or an archaeological, a burial that we're looking at where we actually know what the historical event was. And with this mass grave in Oxford, we're fairly sure that it relates to the early 11th century St Brice's Day massacre. And that came about because of hate speech by a leader. So Ethelred II said he was really fed up with the Vikings. The Vikings were raiding every year. He was paying them increasing amounts of money. But there were also a lot of people of Viking ancestry settled in England. And he said, I've had enough. Go out, find these people who've settled in England and kill them. And he says this, he issues an edict, and then there's this wave of violence. And it would have been neighbour against neighbour. It's quite horrific.
So we've talked about violence, plague, leprosy. Do you ever think, I'd like to do some nice stuff?
I've always been intrigued by the pathology. I'm a medic originally, and I think when I first started learning as a young anatomy lecturer that you could actually diagnose disease in ancient remains, I knew that's where my passion lay. But it's just been completely transformed by genetics. So the book is very much about how archaeology is is being transformed. We're in the era of archaeogenomics. We're reading whole genomes from the past and finding out things like, the plague, which causes the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, was also there in the 6th century. We've got very early cases of it in England. I think I've identified another one, which I've written in the book about.
Yeah.
And then it goes back into the Bronze Age, we know. And then in Europe, we've got cases going back as early as the Neolithic. So this is a disease which has been with us for thousands of years. And every now and then, it resurges. But you end up being very grateful for both antibiotics and vaccines.
We can't have you here on the sofa without mentioning Digging for Britain.
Yes.
Tell us about the most recent filming you've been doing.
So we spend most of the summer going around Britain and dropping in on the most exciting archaeological discoveries, and that's always a joy. At the moment, we're just gearing up. So Series 11 aired in January, and we're just gearing up to start filming Series 12. So at the moment, we're prospecting. So if there's any archaeologists watching who've got exciting digs coming up, we'd love to hear from them. And then we'll be out in June, July, August, September, visiting all those sites. I love it. It must be the only thing that the BBC commissions where they don't know what's going to be in it. Because at this moment, we've got no idea what's going to be in the series, but we know it's going to be amazing.
What kind of thing would you like to hear? If somebody's watching this morning, what would you love secretly to do?
Well, the things I really love are the totally unexpected discoveries. So quite often we're working with archaeologists on, where they're doing archaeology ahead of a big development, for instance, and something completely unexpected that hasn't shown up on maps, hasn't shown up on any of the historical surveys, just suddenly comes to light. So this year we had a roadside settlement just south of Lincoln that nobody knew was there, beautiful Roman settlement just next to Ermine Street. We had an amazing Roman dodecahedron. I loved that because nobody knows what they are. It was about the size of a Rubik's Cube, and it's a dodecahedron made of bronze with pierced holes in it. And honestly, some people think they're for knitting. Some people think they're for sizing spaghetti.
What was it for?
Nobody knows.
Still?
Nobody
Okay.
knows. We interviewed the woman who's doing her PhD on these, and she hopefully by the end of her PhD she might have a better idea about it. But they're wonderful, mysterious objects.
Our viewers, somebody will know.
Yes.
Somebody will be in touch and tell us. A Roman dodecahedron, OK?
Alice,
we'll get an
thank
answer
you
for you
so much. And Alice's book is called Crypt, Life, Death and Disease in the Middle Ages and Beyond. She's also on tour across the UK from tomorrow.